Hello and welcome back to Steve's Tesla. Special treat today. I'm here with Rob Padgett, who's a freelance consultant and is the founder of energyfacts.com.au. And we're going to talk about the new vehicle emission standard, also known as NVES. G'day there, Rob, and welcome to Steve's Tesla.
Always feel welcome there. Steve, thanks for having me on. This is a good opportunity to get some ideas out that I feel aren't very well understood. As you might recall, about 2 years ago, you asked me a simple sounding question, which was, are EVs going to break the grid?
Yeah.
And well, as it happens, that is an incredibly difficult question to answer accurately. Overall, now this is patchy depending on where you are in the country, but overall, the penetration of battery electric vehicles is around the 2% point. It's not much.
Yeah.
Round here where we are, spot checks will show you somewhere between 4 and 6%, depending on which way the wind's blowing. So it's not a universal figure, but all this is about to change, in my opinion, and certainly in the opinion of the government, which went to some trouble to introduce legislation October last year, which is called the New Vehicle Efficiency Standard.
Yes.
And that came into effect the beginning of this year, but the real sting, which is the motivation, the carrot and stick approach, that comes into effect in July. If that does happen, it will be dramatic.
Yeah.
And that's what would lead to that 10 to 20% demand on the grid.
Yeah, true. Well, look, let's start at a baseline. Why don't you just explain for us all what the NVES actually is, what it's trying to achieve, and then perhaps you can step us through where we're at today and what your forecasts are for the future.
Okay, well, the NVES is, as I said, system of carrot and stick. It is based on the carbon dioxide emissions of vehicles. And I will preface everything I'm about to say is my focus has been on light vehicles, passenger cars and SUVs. Right. Even looking at the government's own figures, the impact of light commercial vehicles, you'd be aware of things like BYD Shark and other utes that are coming out. This isn't seen as being material between now and 2030.
Okay.
But coming back to the smaller vehicles, from July, the government legislation, it's in place now, it's law. From July, suppliers will need to measure the carbon dioxide emissions of the vehicles they're offering, compare these against limits set by the government, and depending on where they sit, they will either pay a penalty or receive a credit.
And if I understand it correctly, they're actually able to establish a market to trade credits, is that correct?
That's an interesting question in itself, yes. Tesla, for example, or many of the Chinese manufacturers, they'll basically generate credits all the time. But put yourself in the marketing executive's position there. Would you want to sell your credits, which of course have an upper limit in terms of their value because too much and it's cheaper to just pay the fines. Would you sell those to give your competitors a leg up? Maybe you wouldn't. So I think it's an open question as to whether there will be a trading market in credits, but that's a second order effect. The point is, from July this year, battery electric vehicles, BEVs, start earning credits immediately, and they do diminish over time because the targets set by the legislation change over time. They actually become harsher. So if you've got a car that just squeaks in without a penalty in 2025, it won't in 2026 and so on. And so the chart will show that progressively the penalties get heavier for petrol cars and diesel cars, ICE vehicles, and also the credits diminish too. It's just the way the formula works. It's all just arithmetic. So the motivation to sell zero emission vehicles will be high this year, and it will get higher as we go forward.
Yeah.
Now, what this means, there's another chart that we can look at, which I've called the NVES effect, which is the difference between what the government produced prior to NVES coming in. They called it their business as usual, BAU forecast. The trajectory of electric vehicle sales share is going to depend very much, as we have seen, on government policy, on the economy, and the technology and range of models, of course. But the principal factors, in my mind, is government policy
Clearly.
and the economy. So I looked more carefully at the market, and I realised that it probably was a multi-stage market. Many people are familiar with the so-called logistic curve, or the S curve, which has been used by others to produce forecasts of EVs. It's been used before, and it does describe how products enter a market.
Yes.
And it struck me that what was happening here is that we've got a multi-stage logistic curve, or cascaded logistic curves, I call them.
Yeah.
And if you look at the numbers for the first few years up until 22, 23, you find that you can match that nicely to a logistic curve.
Right.
You can choose or you can identify the parameters that go with that curve, and then realise that there's going to be a kick-off. And the chart that we looked at before shows that kick-off, which is when NVES kicks in.
Right.
And so what I've done is taken the parameters of the early stage, applied them to a second stage with a higher an asymptote, the target that it's heading towards, and produce this model. And since the government has set the policy, I'm just taking this as a single forecast now, and that's what I'm working with.
So on previous videos, I've explained the S-shaped adoption curve, which basically is the introduction of any new technology goes through an S-shaped adoption curve. For some technologies, this is long and slow, and for others, like mobile phones, the internet, it can be a very sharp transition. And they do say that once you hit about 5% market take-up, that's when you go from the early adopter phase, and the S-shaped adoption curve can go exponential. And I'm assuming, Rob, from what you're talking about here, that the NVES could very well be the catalyst that takes us from that low percentage of adoption of electric vehicles and kicks us off into the stratosphere. Do you think
that's right?
Do you think
that's right? You're touching on what are known as tipping points.
Yes, exactly.
Some people do what you just said. Then they look at a threshold, a market share level. But I've looked at it a little more broadly, and I've identified a range of tipping points.
Okay.
Events that are in the environment, the policy and economic environment, that will influence a market take-up. And these include the price parity, as they talk about, which itself isn't simple. It's not just the cheapest one, it's the profile of available vehicles. How does that match buying behaviour? That's one I've looked at. The ubiquity of charging infrastructure, that's clearly another, and so on. There's about four key ones that I found, and these are all going to drive this second phase or this second stage.
Okay.
There will be a third stage, and I think it's pretty unimportant what that is. It'll either be a race to the finish or a little dragging tail, depending on what happens to fuel supplies.
Yes.
So there's another one. But on that topic, there's a little chart that we can look at that just shows what the trajectory, the declining profile for EVs is, ICE vehicles. And by the mid-30s, I think it'll be a tough business case to keep a petrol station open as a petrol station.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. That's certainly what they found in Norway, that are apparently now up to 98% of all new vehicles sold are electric. Many of their service stations are closing, as some of the reports I've seen from China indicate that they just no longer have a business model that supports the sale of fossil fuels.
Nice segue into an interesting point there.
Yeah.
There are a couple of key points that have emerged from the modelling that I've done. My interest in all of this has been on modelling the market.
Yeah.
I haven't had much interest in the models that are in the market. So
Right.
please don't ask me about which is the best
Sure.
EV to buy,
Yeah.
because to me they're all the same. They're just a line in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, sure.
But there are a couple of things to note. That one is that the percentage of EVs in the fleet lags by a considerable amount the percentage in new sales.
Oh, yes.
That's something to bear in mind.
Right.
Then when we talk about new sales, we have to recall or think about what that is. And it's actually two components. One is, people buy new cars to grow the fleet. The fleet grows pretty much in line with population. There's a chart we can look at there that shows the ratio between light vehicles and households.
Okay.
And it's changed from about 1.4 per household in 2005 or 2001. We can have a look at the chart for that.
Yeah.
Through to about 1.5 now.
Right.
So this gives a good baseline for forecasting.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
And so we've got plenty of forecasts. The ABS and whatever have got high and low population forecast models, and using those, it's possible to produce a baseline forecast of fleet growth.
Right.
But that's not the only thing. The other thing is attrition or scrapping.
Yep.
And surprise, surprise, we scrap more than we grow.
Okay.
It's the larger of the two components.
I'm actually a little surprised by that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, have a look at a couple of charts we've got here that show on one the number of cars sold, new, contributing to fleet growth, and the number contributing to replacing scrapped cars.
Okay.
And it's interesting to see during the COVID years, the number of vehicles sold declined, and also people kept their cars longer.
Well, that's
so the scrappage percent went down. That's a word that I don't know that really is a word, but it gets used. I prefer attrition. The attrition rate went down at the same time as car sales went down. And it's just over the last couple of years started to pick back up. We have to just look at the facts. And looking at the facts, if you take the attrition rate as the percentage of the prior year's vehicles that get replaced, it's been running at around 4.3%.
Okay, right.
And this is an interesting figure to keep in mind, because we're going to find that for the NVES to actually work, to do what the government intends it to do, one of two things has got to happen. We've either got to buy a hell of a lot more cars because we're going to be chucking a lot out, or we're going to be forced to buy electric cars a lot more quickly than nature intended. No, there are two things you can do, carrot and stick. There may very well be limits on what the economy can stand, what Joe and Flo car buyer can afford to do. And so this is going to be politically tough. Another point needs to be borne in mind is that the NVES cannot be changed with a simple change of government. It's been very carefully crafted.
Right.
It can only, the minister's authority to change things is limited to only making it more restrictive.
Right, I see. Okay.
That's all that can be done.
They can't ease up on it.
He can't ease. If the minister changes, he can't ease up. It has to be tougher than the year before.
Okay. Well.
So that's, the NVES is a potent tool, which I don't think the industry really understands.
No, I'd have to agree.
There's discussion about how big the penalties will be, fines and whatever else, but I don't think the industry has twigged that this is a sledgehammer. That's why the charts we were looking at show the market taking off.
Okay.
Now, the only limit, or not only, I'm making it sound trivial, the limit will be what the economy can stand. What consumers can do.
So Rob, what has to happen for the NVES to really be effective in reducing CO2 emissions?
Well, basically the NVES has to reach its target, which means achieving a sufficiently reduced number of ICE vehicles.
Yep.
That's it in a nutshell.
Yep.
But that leads to two unavoidable conclusions, alternatives. They're alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
I've modelled that we need to get to a particular figure, which is around 73% maximum of ICE vehicles on the road by 2030 to hit the 2030 target, which is about 15.8 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent reduction, that compared to a future where we just allow for the normal increase in usage of vehicles with no change in the number on the proportion of ICE vehicles, then we would get to a particular level of emissions. But to take where we expect to get to, or where the government expects to get to with the NVES, we'd have to be nearly 16 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent lower. What does that mean? That means that we've either got to scrap cars at a higher rate than we do now, or we've got to move to all electric, and I'll qualify that by either battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid vehicles. They both qualify for reasonable credits, or excellent credits for BEVs, reasonable for FEVs, under the NVES, talk about acronym soup, under the NVES legislation.
And you're going to find, of course, as you say, a few years from now, you've got 5 million electric vehicles getting home at about 6 p.m. at night, plugging in and putting a significant impact on the grid at that point.
Lovely point you just made then, because the graph we can look at now shows how I predict the demand on the grid will grow. And I've got two broad assumptions. If they all have to charge within a 10-hour period, it's 20%. If they do it over a 20-hour period, it's half that. Now that's a really simple-minded and global kind of assumption. And that brings us to where it just becomes totally beyond my capabilities. You need to know more precisely the time profile. You need to know where they're charged. How many are at home, how many are in what suburbs, and then you have to think about the fine grain structure of the electricity network. How big are those street transformers that have got to deliver, hundreds and hundreds of kilowatts to a charging station? It becomes very difficult, and it'll be very localised. So maybe in some areas the grid will be broken, in others it'll be far from it.
Fascinating, isn't it? Well, Rob, look, thanks very much. It's a fascinating insight into where we're going. It's an exciting transition, and there's some engineering and political challenges along the way to get us there. But thanks very much for your contribution today.
You're very welcome, Steve. I hope a few interesting things have popped out here.
Sure have. Thanks, mate. G'day and welcome to Steve's Tesla. This is my channel dedicated to electric vehicles and renewable energy. Subscribe now and let's drive.